Well, thanks again very much indeed for your welcome, and apologies for bringing this British weather your way, but you know, these things happen. I'll give you a tip, by the way, if you ever go and visit Britain, and you might find the British people are not terribly kind of forthcoming about opening up conversations. So the tip is just talk about the weather, okay, and you'll be right in there. All you need to do is say, oh, it's a very cloudy day today, and they'll look up and say, yeah, you're right, you know, it's a very cloudy day. Or if it's pouring a rain, a little bit damp today, isn't it? Yes, you're right, it is a bit damp. That's your real conversation opener. So I just pass that on as free advice. And I'm talking until the slides come up on the screen. So that's also why we'll continue to tell stories. Do I need to press something? Or projector screen, let me press that. That will probably do something. Will that do anything? No? What's happening there? I just like to get on the slides and lectern laptop. Hey, there we go. Wonderful. Excellent. So in the first lecture in the series, in case you missed it last night, I don't blame you, that's fine, lots of things to do. But I began, in fact, by, as Justin was saying, by mapping out a theology of creation that I would like to suggest provides a matrix within which contemporary biology can comfortably be accommodated. In fact, it's precisely this kind of theology that we were talking about last night that provided that great motivation for those early natural historians of the 17th century to do science and to flourish in their natural history and indeed to found the disciplines that we now call things like botany and biology and all that sort of thing. And furthermore, we were considering yesterday how chance is just as much an aspect of God's created order as any other aspect, although the overall process of evolution is very far from being a chance process, given that natural selection exerts this stringent winnowing effect upon the various variants you get out there in the workshop of life, whereby variants that occur in the genomes of living organisms generate slightly different organisms that are then tested out for their evolutionary fitness. So that's what we were talking about yesterday. Now today we will be pursuing in greater depth this whole question of whether, taken overall, evolution can be described as a chance or random process. And in place of a theology of creation, which was really the framing for yesterday's talk, today the framing is more one of natural theology. How much can we infer from a bottom-up inspection of the evolutionary process examined at various levels? And so in order to get that discussion going, first let's listen to what some contemporary atheist commentators have to say on the subject of purpose in science in general, and purpose in biology in particular. Commentators who clearly have no doubt that metaphysical inferences can be drawn from science. Here's a few examples. Here, for example, is Professor Peter Atkins. You probably haven't heard of him, but he's an emeritus professor of chemistry at Oxford University. Somebody, by the way, I've debated with a number of times on radio and other places. And he states, and I quote, that a gross contamination of the reductionist ethic is the idea of purpose. Science has no need of purpose, close quote. Unless we should be in any doubt about the purpose of science itself, Professor Atkins informs us that science is the sole route to true, complete, and perfect knowledge. And here is somebody else from Oxford as well. These people, by the way, they all come from Oxford. I don't know what it is now, but evolutionary biologist called Richard Dawkins, you might have heard of him. Writing, and I think probably on a rather rainy day in Oxford, and I quote, "The universe we observe had precisely the properties we should expect if there is at bottom no design, no purpose, no evil and no good, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference." Something about the weather in Oxford that nurtures gloomy philosophies, I believe. The philosopher Daniel Dennett, coming over now to your own country, agrees with Atkins and Dawkins, asking whether the complexity of biological diversity can really be the outcome of nothing but a cascade of algorithmic processes feeding on chance. And if so, asks Dennett, who designed that cascade? And he answers his own rhetorical question by saying nobody. It is itself the product of a blind algorithmic process. Evolution, he says, is not a process that was designed to produce us. And just for good measure, here's another American philosopher, Alex Rosenberg this time, in his article, Darwin's Nihilistic Idea, declares that Darwinism puts the capstone on denying that there is any meaning or purpose to the universe, its contents, and its cosmic history. And just for good measure, here's a quote from a rather old biology textbook now, but the quote I think is an interesting one to find in a textbook of biology. The real difficulty, they write, in accepting Darwin's theory has always been that it seems to diminish our significance. Evolution asked us to accept the proposition that, like all other organisms, we too are the products of a random process that, as far as science can show, we are not created for any special purpose or as part of any universal design. So the question I want to ask ourselves in this lecture is a pretty straightforward one. Is it necessarily the case that the evolutionary process itself tells us that it has no purpose, which is obviously the claim of these various people we've just been listening to? And in order to address that question, we're going to review some contemporary biology, some of it very recent, as a matter of fact, in order to see whether it is in fact the case that the literature as of this year suggests that evolution is necessarily purposeless. Now I want you to note, by the way, the way in which I'm setting up the argument for this evening. The question being addressed here is not whether evolution displays clear signs of purpose and direction, but rather the opposite question as to whether evolution is necessarily purposeless. And I'd like to suggest that the science itself can be deployed in arguments against that claim, at least to render it less plausible. But to carry out that kind of exercise, we're first going to need to distinguish between two possible uses of the word purpose in biology: functional and metaphysical. As far as function is concerned, then biology is saturated with such teleological, purposeful language. The purpose of a wing is for flying, as the purpose of a mouth is for eating. This was the kind of telos, or goal, with its notion of design that we find in the writings way back when, in the writings of the Stoic philosophers, and then in the early Christian natural philosophers, especially those of the 17th century, and then onwards through to the natural theology of Archdeacon William Paley in the 19th century. Telos that was given then a strictly functional interpretation in Darwin's theory of evolution, in which specific biological organs are adapted by natural selection to increase evolutionary fitness. But if we inspect now the quotes from Atkins and Dawkins and Rosenberg and all those other people that I've just been mentioning to you, clearly it's not the case that they're using the word purpose in that particular way. When Dawkins argues that the universe we observe had precisely the properties we should expect if there is at bottom no design, no purpose, he's making a specific metaphysical claim that there really is no point nor purpose to the overall process of the universe, including in particular the overall process of evolution. And furthermore, says Dawkins, it is the properties of the universe, those revealed by science, that lead to this conclusion. And Dennett is even more specific in his metaphysical conclusion, based on his interpretation of the scientific data, that evolution is not a process that was designed to produce us. Now, clearly, in order to challenge the assertion that the evolutionary process is necessarily without purpose, we first need to have some agreement on what kind of properties we generally recognize in necessarily purposeless entities. Let's start with an easy one: rocks. They just sit there. They certainly don't look very purposeful. Of course, we can find uses for them, like building houses and that sort of thing. They don't seem to have any intrinsic purpose when we just sort of look at them. They appear to be necessarily purposeless. But now what about systems that start simple and gradually become more complex? Well, that in itself doesn't demonstrate purpose. On the other hand, it might make it more difficult for us to conclude that such systems are necessarily purposeless. And what about systems that are clearly under strong physical constraints so that they can only operate or develop in a single direction? Let's say we're hiking in the mountains with no one else around, and we come across two streams. The first is just winding its merry way down the valley in a haphazard kind of way. But the second, we note, is constrained by a series of dams so that the water is directed towards some fruit trees, where it is further divided into smaller streams to water the trees. The first stream we might describe as being necessarily without any particular purpose, but that conclusion would be clearly difficult to make for the second stream. It really does look as if the stream in some way has been constrained and channeled to come to some sort of telos, some overall goal, if you like. And so the water could do no other than be channeled by those constraints. What about, just thinking of a rather different example again, what about our own lives? We could in principle, albeit not in practice, track that very first sperm that fertilized that very egg that became us. Out of the millions of sperms racing along our mother's fallopian tubules that day, it was that particular sperm that won the race to fertilize the egg, thereby determining that we would be male and not female, or vice versa. And we could track our development from that moment on with all the complex gene-environment interactions involved, with thousands of stochastic events contributing to the person that we are today. Yet, would an intimate knowledge of all those apparently random events, together with a detailed history of how our own decisions had changed the course of our lives, lead to the conclusion that our lives are necessarily purposeless? It's hard to see why that would be the case. One last example of this sort of repertoire of the ways in which we use the word purpose, let's think a little bit about the purpose of the history of a country. We might observe many random and stochastic events during its long history. The leading politician who was assassinated that changed the course of the nation's history for perhaps many decades, perhaps for centuries. The invasion in another century that devastated its economic infrastructure. The series of drought at another time that wiped out half its population. Yet, despite all this, as a historian, we might also be able to detect certain common threads running through the years shaped by that country's language, culture, religion, and political systems and choices. And at the least, it might be hard to conclude that, taken overall, the history of that country was necessarily purposeless. Well, there's some very varied kinds of examples just to get us thinking about what we understand by the term purpose in different contexts. And with those in mind now, let's just turn our attention to biology. I'm going to give you 5 examples that I think render less plausible the idea that evolutionary history is necessarily without purpose. And of course, the evolutionary process itself operates at many different levels, from the structure of populations, to the structure and function of individual organisms, to organs, to cells, and to all that wonderful molecular detail that keeps us molecular biologists happy. So I want to give you examples that illustrate all of these, pretty much all, I think, of these different levels. And we're going to start off with this sort of highest level, if you like, and kind of work down more towards the molecular. And I realize this is an interdisciplinary lecture, and I'm going to try and make the biology as accessible as I possibly can, but apologies to those biologists here for whom this is all pretty straightforward, but I just want to make sure that we're all on the same page in seeking to understand some of these remarkable examples. So, first of all, at the highest level of all, let's stand back for a moment and look at the overall sweep of evolutionary history. As we consider the 3.8 billion years of evolution as a whole, the striking increase in biological complexity is pretty obvious. I don't know if you know, but for the first 2.5 billion years of life on this planet, things were really, really small. In fact, they never really got bigger than 1 millimeter across, about the size of a pinhead. There were no birds, there were no flowers, no animals wandering around, no fish in the sea. But at the genetic level, there were lots of exciting stuff going on. And I have to say, as a geneticist, I would love to be transported in a spaceship back to those early days just to do a little bit of genomic analysis of all that wonderful stuff happening. Other people might find it a bit boring, but I would be absolutely fascinated. But as we go through, of course, in that great sweep of evolutionary history, we come then to the origins of the first cells, the first multicellular life forms, about a billion years ago, thereabouts. We get to the Cambrian explosion, 5.5 to 525 million years ago, and then things really begin to hot up. They begin to get more complex. They begin to get bigger. Instead of millimeters, things now start to be centimeters. Really, it's only in the Cambrian explosion period that we do find sponges and algae that start growing up to as big as 5 to 10 centimeters. And then the size of animals begins to increase dramatically from that time onwards. until today we have creatures like ourselves with our brains, with their 10 to the 11 neurons, their 10 to the 14 synaptic connections, the most complex known organs in the universe. As the evolutionary biologist Sean Carroll from the University of Wisconsin-Madison remarks in a Nature review, and I quote, "Life's contingent history could be viewed as an argument against any direction or pattern in the course of evolution or the shape of life. But it's obvious that larger and more complex life forms have evolved from simple unicellular ancestors and that various innovations were necessary for the evolution of new means of living. This raises the possibility that there are trends within evolutionary history that might reflect the existence of general principles governing the evolution of increasingly larger and more complex forms," close quote. So the question is whether the evolution of the shapes of life represent a random walk through all possible shapes and sizes, or whether there are physical constraints arising from physics, chemistry, genetics development, and so forth that channel evolution in certain prescribed directions. In biology, increased complexity generally refers to an increased number of cell types or to the number of parts of an animal or a plant, leading in both cases to an increase in specialized functions. In the Nature review from which I just quoted, Carroll goes on to cite numerous biological data that illustrate the overall increase in complexity that characterizes the tree of life. For example, as illustrated here, multicellular forms of life have evolved many times independently from all three forms of single-celled life, the bacteria, the archaea, and the eukaryotes. Once multicellularity evolves, then there is huge scope for increased specialization in cell functions and in the construction of organs. And as evolutionary diversification and specialization continues, there are certain physical constraints that generate some remarkable morphological and scaling rules known as allometric laws. To pick just one example, actually a very old example, consider Kleiber's law, which states that metabolism equals mass to the 3/4 power, first proposed by the Swiss biologist Max Kleiber way back in 1932. And since that time, there have been literally hundreds of papers disputing, qualifying, and I have to say, in fact, mostly confirming this value, at least for many taxa of animals and plants. Now, as it happens, for our present purposes, the precise scaling value doesn't really matter, as everyone is agreed that a scaling law does indeed exist that relates the basic metabolic rate of an organism with its size. Here's a particularly striking example from a paper published earlier this year, Proceeding of National Academy of Sciences, illustrating the scaling law for trees in the upper panel and then for mammals in the lower panel. M refers to the mass of the animal or plant, and B to the basic metabolic rate. And as it happens, the data fit the 3/4 power scaling rather well. Metabolism does equal mass to the 3/4 power. What's really striking about this finding is that it fits with both plants and animal species that have evolved over a huge range of geographically and climatically different environments. Furthermore, the authors of the present paper also confirm Kleiber's law not just from the empirical data as shown here, but also mathematically by making various assumptions that impinge on the energetic efficiencies of these organisms. Even though animals can move, whereas plants can't, the stringent constraints of energy control in both cases has ensured that the sizes and shapes of both plants and animals have evolved in response to the same mathematical and physical principles. So as we stand back and look at the whole sweep of evolutionary history, we see huge creativity in life, immense diversity, but also in a highly organized way in which the morphology of animals and plants is constrained by the physical necessities of living on a planet with light and darkness, with particular strengths of gravity, with particular atmospheric conditions at particular times, with particular temperature ranges. So, given carbon-based life, there do seem to be only so many ways of living on planet Earth, which is a thought that then leads us to our second main observation on the general properties of the evolutionary process taken overall, and that's the ubiquitous nature of convergent evolution. Now, much has been written on this topic, in particular by my colleague in Cambridge, the paleontologist Simon Conway Morris, So I'll just pause and just give a little brief summary here with a few examples and then move on. But certainly no list of the characteristics of the evolutionary process that claims to counter the claim that the process is necessarily purposeless would be complete without the inclusion of convergence. And convergence refers to the repeated evolution in independent biological lineages of the same biochemical pathway or organ or structure. For example, different types of eye, both compound and camera, have evolved more than 20 different times independently during the course of evolution. That's in separate evolutionary lineages. If you live in a planet of light and darkness, then you're going to need eyes, and so that's what you'll eventually get if you wait long enough. So even though the eye has a very complex structure, it keeps evolving again and again. Convergence also operates at the gene level. For example, cetaceans such as the blue-nosed dolphin, bats, primates have evolved independently for many millions of years, but they all have something important in common. In the case of dolphins and primates, it's because of their large brains. The dolphin brain, actually at 1,500 to 1,700 grams, actually weighs more than the human brain, which comes in at around 1,300 to 1,500 grams. Brain cells are called neurons, and they are the most energy-hungry of all our cells. Hence, of course, the need for frequent snacks if you're carrying out academic work. And bats are energy-hungry due to the incredible rate at which they flap their wings. So there's a big evolutionary pressure then to come up with the most efficient energy production system. And this is provided by Krebs cycle, the key energy-producing system in the mitochondria of our cells. And one of the key enzymes in that cycle is known as IDH2, and if you really want to know, it stands for mitochondrial NADP plus dependent isocitrate dehydrogenase, and I'm just going to call it, you'll be glad to hear, IDH2. And here is IDH2 in its three-dimensional structure. It's 452 amino acids long, and it's folded up in order to carry out its precise enzymatic function. The point of mentioning it here is that, as published in a paper earlier on this year, in all three of the independent lineages of dolphins, bats, and primates like us, there's one single change of an amino acid from a valine to an alanine at position 186. And this makes the enzyme distinct from the IDH2 enzyme, which is found in dozens of other species that are less energy demanding and is very likely related to the efficiency of the enzyme in its role in Krebs cycle, although that has not yet been formally demonstrated. And so the main point in the present context then is that precisely the same mutation has arisen in three different energy-hungry mammalian lineages independently in comparison with 28 other vertebrates in which the IDH2 gene was sequenced, where valine was found at position 186 and not alanine. And if you look carefully at the diagram before you, you'll see three red-colored lines in the diagram, and these then show the precise points at which the alanine 186 mutation originated in these three lineages. I would say a striking potential example, at least, of convergent evolution. And there are many, many, many other examples of that sort in the literature. So, taken overall, evolution is a tightly constrained process. The last question we had at the end of the question time last night was about Stephen Jay Gould and about his famous views about the lack of direction in the evolutionary process. Here's the late Stephen Jay Gould: "We are a momentary cosmic accident," writes Gould, "that would never arise again if the tree of life could be replanted." Sometimes Gould likened the evolutionary history or process to a drunk lurching around on the sidewalk and occasionally falling off. I've actually thought, maybe it's because I live in Cambridge, our Cambridge in the UK, sidewalks are really narrow. It's a really constrained space. And in fact, certainly in my own city, where the roads are designed for horse and carriages, the sidewalks are narrow. Actually, a sidewalk to me speaks of constraint. It speaks of only certain ways of going and not of others. And in fact, in a commentary on Gould's idea of ultimate randomness in evolutionary history, Conway Morris, who, by the way, supplied a huge amount of the data for Stephen Jay Gould for his wonderful book on the Burgess shell, But he writes in this way. He says, and I quote, "It's now widely thought that the history of life is little more than a contingent muddle punctuated by disastrous mass extinctions that, in spelling the doom of one group, so open the doors of opportunity to some other mob of lucky chances. Rerun the tape of the history of life, and the end result will be an utterly different biosphere." So he's expressing here the views of Stephen Jay Gould. "Most notably, there will be nothing remotely like a human, and yet," says Simon Conway-Morris, "what we know of evolution suggests the exact reverse. Convergent is ubiquitous, and the constraints of life make the emergence of the various biological properties, such as intelligence, very probable, if not inevitable." And in fact, Simon has written this book, Life Solution, Inevitable Humans in a Lonely Universe, which I thoroughly recommend, and he has a much more recent book, came out just a few weeks ago from Templeton Press, called The Runes of Evolution, where he continues this particular theme, if you're interested in pursuing it further. And if you just want a free website, which gives you a lot of the material anyway, www.mapoflife.org will give you literally hundreds of examples of convergent evolution to underline this point. So, yes, the rolling of the genetic dice is a wonderful way of generating both novelty and diversity, but at the same time it appears to be restrained by necessity to a relatively limited number of living entities that can flourish in particular ecological niches. If you live in a universe with this kind of physics and chemistry and on a planet with these particular properties, then what you see around you is what you're likely to get. If we imagine design space in the evolutionary process as a matrix of millions of little red boxes, each box representing a possible genome, then the number of boxes that can be filled successfully, the green boxes, appears to be really small in comparison. And so if you like, evolution is like a search engine for exploring design space. Biological diversity is definitely not a case of anything can happen. Only some things can happen, not in a deterministic way, but in a highly constrained way. Now, continuing on that theme, now let's drill down from the general overall sweep of evolution to take a look at some other stringent molecular constraints that underlie the process. An example here is that of the evolvability of the genome as illustrated by what we call in biology gene hotspots. Evolvability is a topic of great current interest in evolutionary biology. How does a living organism's genome evolve from state A to state B without destroying the organism along the way? It's clearly not possible to change the basic bricks and mortar of the system that much, meaning the so-called housekeeping genes that are needed to keep the basic physiological functions going. So instead, evolution, it turns out, tends to act on regulatory sequences or on genes that act as input-output genes, encoding key switching proteins that integrate whole sets of information that are then mediated to downstream effectors. As the authors of a recent review entitled "Is Genetic Evolution Predictable?" comment, and I quote, "Recent observations indicate that all genes are not equal in the eyes of evolution. Evolutionarily relevant mutations tend to accumulate in hotspot genes and at specific positions within the genes. Genetic evolution is constrained by gene function, the structure of genetic networks and population biology. The genetic basis," they write, "of evolution may be predictable to some extent," close quote. By the way, that is, in my day, in the 1960s, when I was learning my evolutionary biology, completely heretical, but it pops up in various places now. And in fact, there are more than 350 such hotspot genes that have now been identified. And I'm just going to give you one example, just so you can see how this works. Let's look at stickleback fish. Three-spined stickleback fish have evolved into many distinct forms in different lakes. The original three-spined stickleback lives in coastal seas, and like the salmon, it swims up rivers to spawn. Now, during the last big retreat of glaciers, which happened 10 to 20,000 years ago, many populations of three-spined sticklebacks were trapped in newly formed lakes. And they've since adapted to those environments. If you look at a marine stickleback, it's pretty heavily armored. If you're out in a big sea, you need a lot of armor there. But when you get to a lake, you really don't need all that stuff, and so the freshwater populations all show illustrations of armor loss. Lakes are, relatively speaking, safer places to be. You don't need to be armed like a tank to live in some little freshwater lake. Now, how could genetic variation evolve in such a short time to generate such different phenotypes without causing changes lethal to the sticklebacks along the way? And so investigations into the genetic basis of pelvic spine loss has turned up a gene called PITX1. It's a protein transcription factor, or that's a kind of activator, regulator of gene expression, and it regulates the developmental program that leads to spine formation. And it turns out that a DNA lesion in freshwater sticklebacks has removed about 500 base pairs or genetic letters of regulatory sequence that normally upregulates PITX1 protein production, specifically in the pelvis. And with the PITX1 protein expressed normally in all other tissues, but virtually lost in the pelvic region, development proceeds normally in all other respects, except for the reduction in body armor. Now, most remarkably of all, mutations in the same or closely related PITX1 gene regulatory regions have evolved independently multiple times in stickleback populations found in different freshwater fishes in various places around the northern hemisphere. And these populations exist in landlocked lakes, let us remember, where there can have been little chance of swapping a fish between the lakes. So the point here is that mutations overall are not really random. There are regions of the genome where variation is much more likely to occur, and in fact it turns out that the gene PITX1 is located in a fragile region of the chromosome that's subject to more deletions of segments of DNA than other regions. So sticklebacks are predisposed to remarkably rapid changes in their pelvic spines at multiple levels. The relevant regulatory gene is located in a highly changeable area of the genome, and the gene in question can act as a master control, body armor, switching apparatus, and variants that reduce pelvic spines will be rapidly selected in environments where their spines decrease fitness. Talk about highly detailed organization and a very high degree of constraint. Okay, there's some genetic examples. Let's just now switch for a little bit to proteins, the building blocks of life. Proteins, as you know, are polymers. They're built out of 20 different amino acids, and it's the precise sequence of the amino acids in turn encoded by the genes that define the properties of the protein. Probably no other known polymer displays the huge range of properties that are discovered and found in proteins. They can be hard and metallic, like the bones in our body. They can be all kind of soft and mushy, like the liver. They can be used as enzymes, highly specific catalysts. They can carry oxygen around the body, which is what they're doing all the time as we're sitting right here, fortunately. And of course, they have hundreds and hundreds of other functions. The mean length of proteins, if you take the whole of the living organisms, is 475 amino acids long. Let's just consider a protein just 100 amino acids long. So that means there are 20 to 100 possible sequences for such a protein. That's a number much larger than the total number of electrons in the universe. We biologists used to suffer from sort of cosmologist envy. We were envious of all those cosmologists with their big numbers, but now we've caught up and we have some wonderfully big numbers. Now, back in the 1960s, when the first three-dimensional structures of proteins were first being solved, at the time it was thought they would all be unique. Since evolution was a random process, or so it was thought at the time, then each protein would reflect a happy accident frozen in time due to its gain in function. But then Max Perutz over in Cambridge and others started showing that proteins with the same functions in different species had very similar structures, recording how his finding was met with disbelief among biologists, even though we now take that fact for granted. And today we know that many different amino acid sequences can fold into the same three-dimensional structure. In some cases, these sequences give no evidence of sequence homology. And so evolution has discovered the same functional structures by finding different ways up the mountain and eventually arriving in the same functional space. And very early on, it was recognized that proteins can be classified according to the different folds that they contain, the sort of mini-structures within the protein. It's the particular way in which their domains are arranged in three-dimensional space. Indeed, it's that particular ensemble of folds that together specifies a protein's function. And over the years, there have been many classification schemes which have been established, and the 3D structures now of more than 100,000 proteins have been established, an amazing accomplishment. So the number of folds in all these proteins is estimated somewhere in the range of about 1,000 to 10,000. It depends how exactly you define a fold. But even if the true number is 10,000, I mean, that's really a tiny, tiny number compared to, let's say, 20 to the 100. In other words, all living things are united not only by having the same genetic code, more or less, but also by possessing an elegant and highly restricted set of protein structures. And only this particular set, presumably, will carry out all the various functions that are required for proteins to organize the biochemical processes of life. So how do proteins evolve? Well, there's a huge, vast literature on that topic, but in our present context, it is the constraints involved that are truly fascinating. One way of envisaging protein evolution is by means of fitness landscapes, as illustrated here. The peaks represent the amino acid sequences for a particular protein that bestow optimal fitness on a particular organism operating in a particular environment, and the valleys represent less fitness. So the question then is, when mutating step by step from low fitness to optimal fitness, are there many paths up the mountain or just a few? Now, one recent study investigated this question by studying how a bacterial enzyme adapted to the presence of a novel antibiotic. And to cut a long story short, what the investigators found was that there were 120 theoretically possible ways for the amino acid sequence of the enzyme to move from no resistance to the antibiotic to optimal resistance by means of random mutations, but in practice only 18 of these ways were actually feasible due to various constraints. So 18 out of 120 were actually possible. And so based on these and lots of other examples, the authors here comment, and I quote, that only a few paths are favored implies that evolution might be more reproducible than is commonly perceived, or even be predictable. There's the heretical word again, popping up in, common garden scientific literature. And convergent evolution also applies just as much to proteins as to other components of living things. As the title of a recent paper on the topic states, convergent evolution of enzyme active sites is not a rare phenomenon. So the specific amino acid sequences of proteins that bestow upon them a specific enzyme activity is no accident. And that, again, contrasts sharply with what biologists initially thought would be the case before such structural studies began. For example, Jacques Monod, the famous French molecular biologist, in his famous book Chance and Necessity, declared, and I quote, that the biosphere does not contain a predictable class of events, claiming also that amino acid sequences show no regularity, special feature, or restrictive character, but rather appear completely haphazard. Each discloses nothing in its structure other than the pure chance of its origin. And Monod, in fact, extrapolated from such assertions in biology, which we now know to be wrong, to also assert that chance with a big C also rules over the universe, whatever that means. And another reason for Monod being wrong is the realization that the repertoire of variant molecules being presented for natural selection during the evolutionary process is often highly constrained for genetic and structural reasons. There's a very interesting example of this, which has come out of the laboratory of Art Louis in the physics department. There, actually, this is work not yet published, and Art kindly gave me permission to mention it. And so his laboratory has been taking a ribozyme, that's an RNA molecule with enzymatic activity, and the one under study was 55 nucleotide bases long. And so using computer modeling programs, it's possible to predict what the structure of any given RNA molecule will be, as its molecules are a lot simpler than protein structures. And so what this research group did was to generate millions of randomized versions of this particular ribosome. And what they found astonishingly was that 25% of all the possible sequences of the 4 genetic letters produced identical structures representing 50% of all the possible 3-dimensional structures, whereas other structures were only generated by a tiny percentage of the randomized sequences. In other words, the system is constrained to select for those structures that are more likely to be available. And in fact, the number of possible versions of this string of nucleotide bases is so huge that there are some structures that natural selection is unlikely ever to see. And so evolution is biased to select for those physical structures that are generated more frequently. That's the take-home message. If you like, the chemical properties of the periodic table of elements ultimately shape what is available for selection to see. I think probably a little recap at this moment might be helpful for you. And I'm sorry if I lost some of you along the way with some of the detail. But what we've done here is we briefly reviewed 5 features of evolution that illustrate the ways in which the process operates within significant physical constraints, making some out to come much more likely than others, even to the extent of being pretty much predictable in some cases. So first, we started by looking at that broad sweep of evolutionary history and noted that it is difficult to look at the narrative as a whole without some sense of directionality, highlighting also those allometric constraints or laws, such as Kleiber's law, as one of the many examples of allometric laws that describe the precise mathematical scaling of biological morphology. Then secondly, we took a look at evolutionary convergence. And third, we thought about evolvability and the critical role played by genetic hotspots. Fourth, we considered proteins and the remarkably limited repertoire of their structures found in living organisms, contrasted with the cosmologically huge potential number that could exist. And fifth, we just briefly looked at an example of RNA structures and the way in which natural selection is only ever presented with a heavily biased selection of structures due again to physical constraints. Now, these 5 examples illustrate a vast possible array of data that we could look at, and we don't have time to do that, but to basically make essentially the same point. Not that life forms are deterministic, nor that their particular emergence and evolutionary histories are inevitable, but rather that the various types of physical constraints reviewed do ensure that certain types of life and not others, given a planet with these particular physical properties, will eventually emerge. Now, of course, there are mass extinctions. Of course, there are random events like the meteorites occasionally destroying large swathes of life on the planet. Of course, there are many stochastic events involved in every evolutionary lineage. When the farmer sows, only some seeds fall on good soil. But the point is that once carbon-based life gets going, from a purely scientific perspective, it does look as if the physics and chemistry of being alive will ensure that life pursues certain restricted directions and not others. So, now for the key question then that we come to, what do we conclude from all of this? I do not present these data as arguments for the existence of God. I do not believe that biological data per se are up to this Herculean task of adjudicating between rival metaphysical worldviews. That's above their pay grade. On the other hand, I do want to suggest that such data count against the idea that the evolutionary process is necessarily purposeless. As suggested at the beginning, we tend to interpret phenomena as purposeless when it displays certain kinds of properties. For example, it's very static, or conversely so random that anything goes and anything might happen, certainly not properties that indicate directionality. But the evolutionary narrative does not seem to display such properties. It looks tightly regulated, law-like, highly constrained, with an overall increase in complexity that makes it look directional. Reading earlier commentators such as Jacques Monod, together with contemporary atheists like Daniel Dennett, late Stephen Jay Gould, and these people, one does wonder whether there might be here an atheism of the gaps. At some stage, an argument for atheism is based on the premise that evolution is a purely chance process in which, had the tape of life been replayed, everything would have come out very different. Ergo, in this view, there can be no God with intentions and purposes for the world. Now, at a time when the starting assumption looked plausible, and it was certainly the assumption with which I was raised in my scientific education, albeit an assertion based on a then gap in our scientific knowledge, the argument looked quite good. However, the scientific data, as we've just seen, actually has now stacked up to make the starting assumption look implausible. So perhaps atheists do run the risk of an atheism of the gaps argument here based on present gaps in our scientific knowledge, just as believers so often fall into that trap likewise when they propose God of the gaps type arguments. So far this evening, we've been engaged in an exercise in natural theology, albeit a rather weak form of natural theology, weak in the sense that it aims not to make grandiose theological claims based on science, but rather use biology itself to counter risky metaphysical conclusions extrapolated out of biology. But now, in the last few minutes, I just want to revert for a moment to the theology of nature, which was central to our theme yesterday for the first lecture. Can the kind of evolutionary process that we have been describing today fit comfortably within the theological matrix provided by the kind of creation evolution that we were considering in the first lecture? I would like to suggest certainly so. The data are consistent with a God who has intentions and purposes for the world, not in the sense of a God who continuously interferes in nature, but in the sense of a God who is immanent in the created order, the one who speaks creation into being and causes things to have causes, to be causes, so that the created order operates within its own God-sustained functional integrity. The evolutionary process in the providence of God then brings about a creative biodiversity in which Scripture makes clear God delights. So the evolutionary process is organized and constrained in such a way that it brings about cooperativity, care for offspring, tool use, intelligence, music, complex communication systems, eventually language, and the evolutionary process in the providence of God also brings about beings with big frontal lobes in which brain size has tripled over the past 2 million years of hominin evolution, people with sufficient brain capacity to have minds that can understand something about the process that brought them into existence. People who can exercise free choice, make moral decisions, worship, and respond to God's love. The capacities with which the evolutionary process has endowed humankind are necessary but not sufficient for spiritual life. For spiritual life to occur, there must be that response to God's love in repentance and faith that brings about fellowship with God. But without our particular evolutionary history, concepts such as repentance and faith would not even be expressible, let alone meaningful, and so we should be thankful to God for that history. Indeed, we have much to be thankful for, not least for our own existence as we consider the evolutionary process as an intrinsic aspect of God's created order within which we live and move and have our being. But, and here's the question that we'll pose for tomorrow's lecture, did the process really have to be that long and wasteful with such massive extinctions and with the pain and death of trillions of living creatures? And what about the genetic variation that is essential for evolution, but which also causes cancer and thousands of different genetic diseases? Why would a God of love speak into existence a created order with such properties? As I say, those are the questions that will occupy us for tomorrow's lecture. Thank you very much for your attention.
Dr. Alexander, thank you very much for that informative and, might I say, up-to-date lecture on biological evolution. Now I'd like to invite Dr. Lahti to respond.
Thanks for having me back here, my beloved Gordon College. And I'm honored to follow one of the most balanced and insightful voices in science and faith, who also happens to be a friend of mine. I very much liked hearing Dr. Alexander speak of the aspects of the natural world that inspire him regarding purpose in nature, and they inspire me as well. As a respondent, I ought to provide a somewhat different perspective, but here it's not going to be so much a disagreement as just a change in emphasis, so we'll see what you think about it. I'll start by saying one thing that most of you will probably like, and then I'll go on to say something else that some of you might not. So first of all, just speaking for myself, I love the concept of ultimate purpose. The concept relates intimately, for instance, to what I, as a biologist, would consider to be the two pillars of human uniqueness, morality and religion. In particular, without ultimate purpose, morality to me would simply be a social contract, something we implicitly agree to abide by, but nothing that has a sovereign right to rule my life. I might have been born into a community, but I don't see how that fact by itself requires me to live a certain kind of life, regardless of my own will or desires. I might join the club and choose to do so to be a good guy or out of fear or for whatever reason, but I'm free to ignore it too, and on what basis would someone force it on me? And if you disagreed with me, why should I, as a free human, listen to you? So that perspective assumes no purpose to my life except that which I give to it. But what if human life does have ultimate purpose, by which I mean that there is a reason why I exist, that I'm like a knife that can be sharp or dull, and only a sharp knife is living up to its reason for existence? Now, if this is the case, we have a morality that I can respect, that I am drawn to. Now we've made a life lived by rules interesting, inspirational, even necessary if we are to be truly and fully ourselves. So where can we get this ultimate purpose? Well, that's where religion comes in. The concept of God as creator is the only idea that I know of that's powerful enough to imbue me, anyway, with a belief in my own ultimate purpose. You can take a lot of things as guiding principles in life, but God is the only one that will guide whether you like it or not and whether you follow it or not. And that's why nothing but God is strong enough to undergird, to provide, and to enliven the idea of ultimate purpose. So that's the candy. That's what I assume most of you will like. The thing that I want to say now is a little less agreeable. It's that none of the things that I learn about nature from science gives me any reason to believe in ultimate purpose. I must say I appreciate things like the trend towards increased complexity over evolutionary time. I find the constraints on the kind of life that can exist professionally interesting. And being a fan of natural selection, I particularly like the preponderance of convergent evolution in similar environments. But I must admit that I'm so constituted, I guess psychologically, that I don't consider any of these things to yield in me any greater of a sense of purpose in nature than if things came out a different way altogether. In fact, if there was in a particular world, only one organism, and it was only 1 millimeter wide, or even if there was a particular world where there was only a rock, I would still have the belief that I have now that there is some sort, probably modest, of ultimate purpose in the same way as I do now in our bewilderingly complex and diverse world. And the reason is that concept of, or that question of ultimate purpose for me is determined at another level of investigation entirely, the spiritual or metaphysical level at which we decide whether the world is somehow simply a ground-up manifestation of spontaneously derived regularities, therefore without any purpose at all, or else the produce, the artwork, the expression of a being that is bigger than the created. To me, that question makes all the difference. And it's not because I don't have my heart open to creation. I love nature. Wordsworth's my favorite poet. Thoreau's my favorite American writer. I insist on living an hour north of my job in New York City because my family and I have to live among our furry and feathered and leafy friends. And some of this is actually thanks to people that my wife April and I met when we were here at Gordon, such as Dick Wright. And I do see, in Shakespeare's terms, tongues in trees, sermons in stones, books in running brooks, and good in everything. But, and this is the point, it's only a prior faith, logically prior faith in God that convinces me of the purpose of his handiwork. Otherwise, and this is important too, nature is inspiring. It always was inspiring to me, but the inspiration seems to be able to have any direction at all. Its sermons are all form, and we must provide some content. So what is that spiritual content by which we can make sense of nature's inspiration, and how do we access it? Well, I don't think it's from science, despite the fact that it can be an engine of natural inspiration. It can produce more and more of it, but it doesn't tell us how to interpret it. In fact, our science is, or it should be, at its best, is pretty much the same whether we're atheists or not. I don't mean that we see it the same way. It can be a sacrament for some and not for others. But I mean our standards and our results should be the same. Atheistic biologists, if they're knowledgeable, if they were sitting in this audience, would agree with everything that Dr. Alexander just said about nature. That's a great thing, actually, that we shouldn't differ on the facts. God bless reason and observation and the always emerging, rocky, shifting, fallible consensus of science that we've been hearing about. But two equally knowledgeable people, scientifically knowledgeable people, can nevertheless differ on their metaphysical interpretation, the meaning, the deeper implications for things that are not scientifically known, but are nevertheless believed or loved or hoped for. To find the root of these differences, we have to go beyond the science to their faith commitments. We all have faith commitments that govern what the broader picture looks like of the world. For theists, I would say that the picture is expansive and includes a notion of ultimate purpose. But for the new atheists like Atkins, Dawkins, and Dennett, their faith commits them to be restrictive and exclude purpose. Okay, I'd like to offer another principle and see what you think of this one. No physical process indicates ultimate purpose any more than another. No physical process indicates ultimate purpose any more than another. It's just an idea for your consideration. In other words, all physical processes are equally consistent with ultimate purpose. I see well-meaning scientists of faith sometimes looking for things that make life seem less contingent, looking for genetic constraints, for exceptions to natural selection, for overall trends and biases in evolutionary history. And I think although their science is perfectly good and I enjoy learning about these things, I think sometimes some of them are personally invested in those particular things for the wrong reason. We must ask ourselves, does God play favorites among the mechanisms that he has chosen for the unfolding of creation? Is God truly more glorified by one process than another? Does constraint somehow reveal him, whereas selection does not, because maybe selection competes with him or replaces him? Does God favor convergence over divergence evaluatively, or does the repeated evolution of similar traits or life form mean that God is more in control, or that it even demonstrates his control? By the way, I'm not saying that Dr. Alexander is saying this today. I'm just offering a question based on some other people. It's ideas. Should the particular causes of mutations, for instance, whatever they happen to be, matter to our perspective on the purpose of nature? My answer to these questions, my tentative answer is no. We're already committed to a faithful perspective when we do our science or read the scientific literature, regardless of what we might find there. Starting from this perspective, all of the mechanisms, the patterns, the observations, they're simply knowledge or potential knowledge. They might not be true. And we should be open to anything in this realm. Whatever we find, no matter what it is, we will be thinking God's thoughts after him, discovering the blueprint. We would be seeing how the potter decided to mold the clay. There's no better or worse discovery here, if this is true. Nothing that would especially reveal that he did it, and nothing that would undermine the idea that he did it. There's just more and more understanding, more and more content and direction to nature's inspiration. Now, I mentioned I liked Wordsworth. One of my favorite poems is The Tables Turned, where he wrote that one impulse from a vernal wood will teach us more of man, more of moral evil, and of good than all the sages can. I had to memorize that, actually. I loved it, but I no longer believe that it's true. I think it goes too far. I love nature, and I'm amazed at it, and this amazement enriches my understanding of God. However, I don't look to nature to understand good and evil, nor for hints as to whether it has ultimate purpose. I think theists should assume that it does. And if nature speaks to us about how it fulfills this ultimate purpose, or what it is, perhaps in conjunction with Scripture, it is only because we have already understood nature to have such a purpose. I think it is entirely through the eyes of faith that we see ultimate purpose in nature, and we are going to see it regardless of what it is that we end up finding there. Thank you.